There's a lot of text on these slides. I'm not going to read them out. You can sort of either half listen to me, half read the text, or dream between the two or something. But it's there to remind me roughly what I meant to say. And I will sort of whiz past some of it or highlight other bits as I feel sort of is suitable. I'm giving a sort of introduction to my work sort of overall, but it moves towards talking about this large project we're just starting, but it also talks a bit about my sort of personal background in terms of my relationship with landscape, because I think that's a very important part of what's going on in the UK, in cultural geography, in literary studies. A lot of people are bringing their personal stories much more to the fore in the way they're doing research. I am, I think, the first professor of environmental humanities in the UK, but they did say you can make up your own title when they gave me the job, so that's partly why that is. But it's a very growing area internationally. There's a lot going on in Australia, in certain parts of Europe, and in the US, and so I think the UK really needs to develop it, and it's really great if that's going on here as well. So there's just a few things here. I've now started. I've sort of got into the whole blogging thing. So I've started a blog on environmental humanities, which has a number of resources on it about where these other centres are, but also some effort to define the area and discuss it. But I just point out. I might put my glasses on actually because this stuff on the thing is quite small. There's a new open access journal called Environmental Humanities. I won't think that's not a word really. There's a new environmental journal called Environmental Humanities, open access, but I think it's a very going to be a very strong journal and have a really high profile. And it's edited by Tom van Doornen, who studies in Australia, but he's been on secondment to the Rachel Carson Centre in Munich, and also working in Stockholm as well. And I've got a paper coming out in that, in fact, in about a couple of days' time. So anybody's interested in environmental humanities or writing for it or finding out what's going on in it, that I think that's just about the first port of call. The Rachel Carson Centre in Munich to us seems like a really good thing. It's very well resourced. Its ambitions seem to be completely congruent with what we think should be happening at the moment. In the UK, there's all sorts of things going on, as you might imagine, with election and everything. But there has been a real sort of drawing back of funding from the arts and humanities and towards what they call the STEM subjects: science, technology, engineering and maths. A lot of universities are very upset about this, particularly those who really teach the the humanities of various the arts and humanities in various forms. But to us, it's a fundamental mistake. Society is not. The direction of society is not just created by science and technology and engineering and maths. The direction of society is created by culture, by philosophy, by literature, by history. Unless you've got handles on those things and some sort of way of intervening with them or rethinking them, then you're really going to struggle. Any idea of sustainability is not going to happen just delivered through STEM subjects. And if you think of the Romantic movements, late 18th century, it completely transformed humanity's relationship with nature. It wasn't a scientific movement, although science played its part in it. It was an artistic, intellectual, philosophical movement, and that shaped nature-society relations substantially. So this last quote here, I'm going to look at that a bit more, because I'm struggling to read this on this screen, actually, it's a bit small. So this actually is off my blog, so one feels duty-bound to try and define things. So humanities have always, really when we're saying environmental humanities, really we should be saying environmental arts and humanities. Let's not split the arts and the humanities up. But anyway, I'm going to just say humanities for the sake of brevity. The humanities have always engaged with ideas of people's relationship with place and nature. That's obviously in literature, it's obviously in art and in music. So what is new about the environmental humanities? Well, the new thing is that continued reflection and sort of creative practice about people's relationship with nature is being now reflexively done in the era of ecocide, which has got quote marks around it, because I'm going to refer to ecocide a bit more. But that is really the global environmental crisis, which is quite plain to see if one, looks at all for any length of time. We're in really, really deep trouble. I'm not particularly optimistic. I have 2 children, and I fear for their future. I fear for, the future of many people and many species on the planet. There's lots of exciting and good things going on, but our general direction of travel in modern society is absolutely not good, as far as I'm concerned. So for me, the environmental humanities has got to really look that squarely in the eye and confront it. So I've ended up being a professor of environmental this thing because I'm now leading a very large HA Arts and Humanities Research Council grant, and it's called Towards Hydrocitizenship, Connecting Communities with and Through Water Issues. The title's a bit more complicated than that, but really we want to talk to citizens in urban areas and in rural areas about their relationship with water, and not with flooding, not with droughts, not with water quality, not with water scarcity, but water as a whole, treating it holistically, and how those issues intersect, but also their relationship with each other through water, most obviously upstream and downstream relationships, but there's different uses of water, different needs from water, but also between humans and non-humans. And hydro-citizenship, we chose that term as a deliberate subset of ecological citizenship, which I'll talk about a bit more. It's about re-questioning what a human being is, really, how we see ourselves and how we see ourselves in nature, and that's what the Romantic movement did, but we need to be doing it again now if we're going to get anywhere near any sort of sustainable future. Before doing this large grant on water and communities, which has about 8 universities and lots of partners, community partners, artists in it, I've done a lot of other research on trees, on treed land, trees, woods, forests. I've also written about memory and landscape. And basically, I've done all these things because I've been a researcher rather than a teacher. I have done some teaching, but since I did my PhD at Bristol, I've been doing research projects and writing research papers, so I have lots of things going on, and they sort of join up, hopefully, to some extent, anyway. So I am going to go through a bit through my background, going back to the sort of family thing and the landscape thing, just this position about ecocide and where society is in relationship to nature. I'll just talk about the trees research a bit, and I will talk a bit about how I and the people around me, not because I'm doing it, but it's people I work with have similar sensibilities, including a lot of key cultural geographers in the UK. So I'll talk about methods and theories a bit, and then talk a bit about floods, tides and water. So Bettina, who came here, who's a Dutch academic from Groningen, we've done some work on tidal landscapes together. And then I'll talk more about the water project. So I actually grew up on a farm in South Wales, near Cardiff, in the sort of late early 1970s is when I can remember it, so it's quite a long time ago now. And it was just when farming was modernising, really post the Second World War. My dad was a dyed-in-wool old-fashioned farmer, and he was absolutely... my mother had said he had no cosmic thoughts. He wasn't an intellectual. He was interested in politics, but he was not a philosopher of any type. He just liked driving tractors, milking cows, chopping trees, and doing all that sort of stuff. And there is an element of me, I've got quite a lot of that in me. I quite like chopping things. But my mum was, it was quite a weird sort of setup, because she was deeply poetic, and she'd read enormous amounts of novels. She couldn't drive. She never learned to drive. And so I had this sort of quite bipolar upbringing of 2 really different influences. But I come from a very big, complicated, large, quite troubled family, and we all lived in this huge, great farmhouse. Oh, I keep looking. There's 2 slides on this. It's very confusing. Anyway, You'll see the house in a minute. But this farm was being changed quite a lot. My dad, just doing what lots of farmers did, you know, for good economic reasons and for other reasons, was modernising. Some of the hedges were pulled up out the farm, and you know, and sort of technology is changing. I found that changed the landscape, and that sort of lost the landscape quite upsetting. You know, I felt I could have, even without knowing it, I think I had sort of ecological empathy, I suppose, or something like that. And then the whole thing got lost on a larger scale, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And I had quite a funny upbringing for various other reasons. I'm very dyslexic, which might be evident in certain ways within what I'm doing now. And so I really struggled at school and stuff, and felt really pretty disorientated. I didn't quite know where I was in the world. And so I think I became very attached to the landscape that we grew up in for that reason as well. And as the farm has changed, even when I was a sort of late teenager, I collected lots of material, took lots of photographs. I managed to get hold of a camera. And I ended up at art college, so I was doing sort of art-related work about the farm. So I was doing sort of ecological art about this landscape a very long time ago, way before I was a cultural geographer or an academic of any sort. But I'll just wander over here. So the farm is here. This is the Severn Estuary, and this has the second highest tides in the world. So the sea will go up and down at least twice as much as this building in the space of 6 hours. So that's the whole sea rising and falling. And the whole thing is totally amazing, and it's shaped ecology and culture of this landscape, so I got very involved in that. And I sort of lived or studied or gone to school around the Severn Estuary, and I feel it's central to my life. That this landscape is central to my life, really, and my almost my psychogeography. But there's always, you know, there's always a risk that they're going to barrage this for tidal power, which would destroy the tidal range. And so I lost the farm I grew up on for various reasons, but also I feel this wider landscape is at risk, and that sort of informs quite a lot of what I do, I think. So I was the youngest of 6 children. So this is one of my brothers. That's the house, and there was a lot of people living in the house. It was pretty chaotic and wild, really. And this is it. And this is the landscape and the estuaries down here. It was very, very beautiful land with fantastic flowers and hedges and trees, and very ancient. It was a very ancient farmstead with really, really old buildings. And I took all these photographs in my late teens. So that's my dad did the garden. So this is the apple trees in the garden. I was quite younger than my siblings, so they were sort of off in gangs a bit, and I was on my own quite a lot. And so I felt I had more relationship with the place than with the people, almost. Just taking photographs in the barn of the cows, and I do quite a lot of work about memory and landscape and photography now, which I'm still puzzled by this stuff almost. What does it mean to have a negative of the light that was at the place at that time? And some, you know, a lot of this stuff I've never really processed it or worked with it, so I just bring it into my work when I can, but it's all still there as a big question. So this is the view out my bedroom window with the Severn Estuary at the bottom, and Bristol over the side. So at one point we lived on one side of the estuary, and then for various reasons we had to move. We moved to the other side of the estuary. So you sort of moved you moved over the water from one country to another, from Wales to England. And Cardiff, the city was there, so it was too close. Cardiff was too close, really. So that's I became quite interested in this whole idea of what photographs do in relation to memory, and I was really struck by Prosser's. He sort of inverted the idea of what photographs can do, not bringing the past into the present, but the reverse. And so I've done a book on landscape and memory, which talks quite a lot about all this sort of stuff. But in the mid-1970s, our farm was brought with a compulsory purchase order. So the authorities said, we want your farm for housing. So we had no choice. We were sort of evicted from it. And they just came and drove these huge great bulldozers through the whole thing. But we were allowed to keep the farmhouse while my family looked for another farm. So we were just there when they started to bulldoze it around us. And so this next photograph, I need a pointer really. This is not to do. Right. The farmhouse is here. That was my grandmother's house, and this is just the farm being worked with a combine, obviously. And those trees are the same trees as those. And this is the house we lived in. Everything else was completely wiped away and covered in houses. It was a really, really shocking thing to live through. I know, obviously people live through all sorts of shocking displacements and violence. But I think it's marked me and my family quite significantly. And there's quite a lot of serious ill health in my family, my brothers and my father. And I don't think it was totally down to this process. In fact, I'm pretty sure it wasn't down to this process. But it certainly didn't help in that respect. So you can go to this on Google Map now. So that's the house. It's still there now. That's where we grew up, and there it is. And so this is where all the barns and the gardens. There's not a single trace of it left now, and all the fields and everything is just gone. So I'm going to switch now. So I'm just setting it out as important. I think need to reflect on where you're coming from when you're talking about nature-society relations. So I'm a big believer in this idea of ecocide. So most of this slide is just taken from Guattari's book called The Three Ecologies, which I think is one of the most important books around, and everybody should look at it. It's PDF online. It's free. It's not very long. And it was actually published 25 years ago this year in French, so quite a long time ago now. And if you read the opening 4 or 5 pages, probably it's not, you can obviously get into the whole thing, but the first 4 or 5 pages are just so shocking to read, because it says there's a dreadful rise of fundamentalism going on in the world. The conventional political system is just not responding to the environmental question at all in any meaningful way, and it still hasn't. And then he talks about a need we have to have a radical rethink about what humans are and how they live, in relationship to nature. And so, but his theory is that ecocide is going on. A lot of people say about the French post-structuralists, their politics were very slippery, complicated, indetermined, but it's not the case in this situation. No, he was one of the, obviously, Deleuze, Guattari, a lot of their ideas were very, very complicated and challenging, but in this book he says, ecocide is a fact, it's happening, and the book is called The Three Ecologies, because ecocide is happening to ecology as we understand it, biodiversity. It is being wiped off the planet, and there's, the WWF, World Wildlife Fund report came out in 2014. It says the biodiversity of the planet has halved in the last 70 years. So if you think what life is, setting aside any theological extra planetary existence, really all life is biodiversity of life on Earth, and we don't know if there's any other planets in the universe that have got life like this on it. So this is the only complex biosphere we know of in the universe, and we've reduced it by half in the last 70 years. And it's a really, really, very, very terrible thing to be doing. So the three ecologies, that's the first ecology, the actual, ecology as we understand it, nature. The second ecology is cultural diversity, that capitalism is really wiping away, obviously other types of society, other types of culture, other types of economy. The what happened in, you know, when we colonized America, India, Canada and stuff like that are obvious examples of that it was a complete eradication of ways of life, just about. And then the third ecology is psychic ecology. You know, what is an individual? We're being colonized, we're being constrained, we're being damaged by the push to consume and by state power and corporate power. And in the UK, you know, there's terrible mental health problems, there's terrible physical health problems. You know, in one way you can say modernity is the era of great health because there's better food and people have got bigger because they're better nourished. But in fact, there's the health stats in the UK are really, really grim. So there has been an upgraph of public health in one way, and certain things have got better, but a lot of things have got very profoundly worse as well. So Guattari is saying you've got these three ecologies, they're all interlinked, they're all being eroded by the same sets of forces. And then he says the only true response to the ecological crisis is on a global scale, provided that it brings around an authentic political, social and cultural revolution, reshaping the objectives of the production of both material and immaterial assets. You know, he does want a spiritual, political and ecological revolution, really, which obviously is very challenging to bring about. But then, if it doesn't, where are we going to end up? And I suppose it depends what sort of time frame you're looking at. If this sort of stuff is really going to happen, but if it doesn't, I think it's a very, very troubling picture. Human exceptionalism, which has arisen for all sorts of complicated reasons, why we set ourselves apart from nature and above nature so markedly, and the whole question of human rights as against non-human rights, which obviously people like Peter Singer and all the other animal rights people have talked about, and various other things. The ideologies that dominate sort of modern politics, and some theological sort of drivers have all built to this position, and we're told we live in the Enlightenment. That is a great story of civilization. You had the Dark Ages in the middle, medieval Europe. You had the Enlightenment, and we emerged from the Dark Ages. To me, that is a complete misreading of the whole situation. We are now in the deepest Dark Ages we could possibly be in, because we're destroying the world essentially. And so people like Brad Evans and Julian Reed are all writing in sort of not exactly the same sort of terms, but they're also saying, look, we're in a really, really bad position here. And in the UK, the whole resilience agenda is massive, and it's been used in a certain way. And this book is a political theory book saying the way that resilience agenda has been used in the UK is very destructive. It's an entrapment of people into insecurity and individualism rather than a real move away to any form of sustainability. So that's my rant about where we are in relation to nature-society relations, where we are in relationship to culture and politics and stuff like that. The force for us to be consumers, we live in a consumer society, the amount of information that's pressed into us to be consumers, to build our identities through consumption, the billions of pounds that's spent on marketing that is bombarded onto people all the time is a really big thing to try and break out of. And we've had discussions about how do you move from being a consumer society to a creative society. And this book, and the last line in this book says something like, if you want to get out of this, you've got to live a poetic life. You've got to become a creative person rather than a consuming person. So I'll step back. So that's my rant about all that. So I did a load of work about trees, and we were, I suppose, in about 2000, we did a project on trees in place. We just chose local tree parks in Bristol and a few other things like that, and we studied them very intensely, and they all had historical records so we could tell the history of the places, but we put the trees at the centre of the narrative. So this is a way of breaking down human exceptionalism and a challenge to human agency. So this book, Tree Cultures, was very much about talking about how the trees actually very palpably made these places. If it wasn't for the trees, the places would be politically different, they'd be culturally different, they'd be ecologically different. There's no way you could account for how those places ended up if you just told a human story. And it drew upon actor network theory, dwelling, deep ecology, and all sorts of, all sorts of other things. I'll talk a bit more about our sort of theoretical usage later on. And it was sort of one of these slow burn things. When you write a book, you think you're so fed up writing it at the end, you never want to see or think about it again. So, and because I'm dyslexic, I thought it was probably full of typos. And the proofreader had a nightmare trying to sort it out, but I think they did quite a good job. Because anyway, it was reviewed reasonably well, and it's been quoted quite a lot, and extracts have been put into readers and stuff like that. And so ever since then, I've been still sort of writing more about trees. So just last year, I was invited to go to Canada, and we did a political ecology about. There was a big conference about urban forestry. And so we sort of did an update of this book in a way of the theory of it. And what really wasn't in this book, what wasn't in the top book, which is in the chapter in this book, is we've gone much more into the whole idea of affect. There's been a big turn to affective sort of approaches within geography, and I'll say a bit more about that now. And that's part of the emotional geography's turn, really. So before we were talking much about the agencies of nature, the power of nature. And if nature has agency, maybe it is worth some ethical consideration as well. Really challenging the nature-culture divide. That's a lot of my work has been trying to. You have nature, you have culture. They've been separated out, and that schism has caused terrible damage. Well, it's never been separated out. That's what Ingalls said. There's never been such a thing as nature-culture. It's always entangled. So these were trying to tell entangled stories. But in the later stories, emotion, how trees affect us, how humans and trees might communicate in a city, and communicate seen in sort of a wider sense than what one might imagine. So fundamentally, I'm a pragmatist, and I put that with a capital P because I really am. So the pragmatists were people like William James, who was the brother of Henry James, the famous novelist, John Dewey, and Richard Rorty later. So William James was philosopher in America, the beginning of the 20th century, and they were radical they were politically radical, they were philosophically radical, in ways that a lot of people are only just waking up to now. And they were relativists to some extent, and but their idea really is theory is not a representational business. It's not a thing of truth revealing. One, if you do that, you're still stuck with what to do once you've done that. But two, you never really can know if you're revealing the truth in any sort of objective way. They're saying the whole point of theory is it's an experiment, it's a thought experimentation and a practice experimentation. You do it, and then you see what happens, and then you think, well, you sort of, it's a rolling assessment of what are the implications of thinking like this. So the famous pragmatist sort of slogan is theories are tools. They're not truths, they're tools, and you can use them if you want to, and if you don't like what they're doing, then you can put them down and pick up another tool. And so that's what we do, really, more or less. And so, and there's people like Nigel Thrift, who was going back to the Bristol thing. If you know about Bristol, Bristol was one of the most famous geography departments in the world for a while, and Nigel Thrift was very instrumental in that. He's now VC of Warwick, and everybody hates him. But there we go, because he's paid so much. But he worked very much in this way. So when I do supervise PhD students, one of the first things I always give them is an article by Nigel Thrift called it's 1999 Steps to an Ecology of Place, and it was written for an Open University book. If you know what the Open University is in the UK, it's the one that anybody can sort of go and so. But their materials are very meticulously prepared, and they source the most forward-thinking thinkers because their materials are going to last 10 years as a course. And so it's a fantastic book called something like Human Geography Today. There's a whole reference there. No, anyway, so Thrift wrote Steps to an Ecology of Place. And in it, he uses feminism, he uses active network theory, he uses Game and Metcalfe, passionate sociology.
he uses Ingold's dwelling, and he says, I like that. I like what Actor Network says for this bit. I like what feminism says for this bit. And then out of that, you build your own theoretical narrative out of borrowing, out of a theoretical box of tools, really. And so the paper I wrote about this was Stepping from the Wreckage, Non-Representational Theory and a Promise of Pragmatism. So non-representational theory has been quite controversial in the UK, because people say, how can you try and do academic theory and knowledge building where you say you're not trying to represent the world? But that's exactly what the Pragmatists said. You're not trying to represent the world, you're trying to rebuild the world. You're trying to have a creative all theory and knowledge is a creative intervention into the world, and it should be as well. And that's really what non-representational means. You're not trying to represent what's past or what you're looking at. You're trying to go in there and make something new. Your account of it and what you're being account of it changes. And then there's people like John Law, who was very connected to Actor Network theory, who said, if much of the world is vague, diffuse or unspecific, slippery, emotional, ephemeral, elusive or indistinct, changes like a kaleidoscope or doesn't really have much pattern at all, then where does that leave social science? Social science tried to be like the natural sciences and tried to be objective and tie the world down and cut the world up and produce representations of it. But if the world is so in flux and so messy and so dynamic, then you're chasing a lost cause, really. So to me, I'm fundamentally a non-representational. Our approach is fundamentally non-representational. We don't really say it in our research grants because it's likely to cause trouble. But what we say is all our research is a creative practice rather than a representational practice. And it says this, we're making new things with communities. So we're not studying what's there, we're making new things. And I'm a big believer really in ad hoc geographies, making it, and it's going to sound a bit terrible, but there was Philip Krang, they did a session at the Royal Geographical Society annual conference last year called Ad Hoc Geography. It's about people, you build narrative or a story or a research project out of what's to hand, and you don't have a systematic plan. You go into a situation, you see what's in the situation, and then you respond to it, and that's really what ad hoc geography is. But it's also, this is another huge chunk, but this is just another chunk from a German writer, Siebold, who's had a massive influence in the UK. And this is from an interview. There's a book called The Emergence of Memory, and it's a series of interviews with Siebold. And this is actually an account of him, how he did his PhD. And he said, my PhD research was completely unsystematic. And he uses an analogy. He said, it's more like a dog. A dog looking for a scent will just run around the field. It'll pick up the scent. It'll just follow it wherever it goes. And it's a totally different way of looking at how to do something and explore something and find something. And he says, I don't really think systematic research can be innovative and creative because the system you lock it into is going to lock it up. And he says that really, for him, he said, I only think you can do creative research if you have this open, contingent, spontaneous reaction to what you find. And he says in this thing, he says, you go to one place, you find one thing, that's a trigger to going somewhere else and finding another thing. And that's a trigger. And if you read things like Rings of Saturn, that's exactly what he does. And in different books, he does it in different ways. But in Rings of Saturn, he's walking, he finds something, and then they can talk about the Chinese Empire. Kind of obviously his work's all about history, colonialism, violence, and all that sort of thing. But how he gets into that is he just goes and finds something, and it's a portal, but you don't know what it's going to be, and you don't know what it's going to be a portal to. But once you get there, you realise, and then you go through that portal, and then there's another portal, and then off you go. And then he says in a place in the country, one of his last books to be published before his death in the UK, I have slowly learnt to grasp how everything is connected across space and time. So Tim Ingold, who's been incredibly influential in the UK as well, an anthropologist, he sort of gave up talking about dwellings. It was a bit controversial. So he said the world is just a meshwork of connections. So meshwork is a big thing. So to me, this is the same. It's really saying everything is interconnected. So in research, you can enter the meshwork anywhere and go anywhere and talk about anything. And how that happens, and you you might end up. We've got a new PhD student starting, and he's already saying, look, I've started on one subject, but I've ended up looking at similar issues through a totally different case study. Can I do that? Yes, go and do that. So you can be pulled. The world, instead of you sort of trying to sort of drive the world, you let the world drive you. It's a better way of making knowledge, well, possibly anyway. And then I found this book when I went to. I think maybe when I went to see Bettina, there's no way I'm going to pronounce the names of it. It's a new history of environmentalism, and it says, the founding principle of ecology is that everything is connected to everything else, and this is between humans and nature as well. So I think that's a really important sort of underpinning of what I do and what the people we work with do. So I'm just going to jump to some of the sort of more specific work we've done now. So tides, we had a Dutch Research Council grant. So it's almost like twin two tidal landscapes between the Severn Estuary, which I showed you, and the Wadden Sea, which I imagine you know is quite. I've got no idea where we are, so I just got on a plane. Bremen is we quite near the coast? Yeah, and the Wadden Sea. Yeah. Anyway, well, we're going to go back there, but it's sort of comparative sort of exploration of these two landscapes, and what sort of landscape scholars are saying about it, but most importantly what the artists and communities who live with these amazing landscapes are doing and saying. And the Wadden Sea is a World Heritage Site, and it is stunning and exciting. The Severn Estuary is dramatic in a very different way. It's very industrial, it's quite polluted, it doesn't look amazing, but the tide itself is very spectacular. So we've done, it's also like we've just got two blogs, and we've done these, what we called art atlases. So this is the Severn Estuary, where we've just collected as many examples of artists and writers, art very loosely defined, and just logged them on a Google map, and each of these icons will take you to a description of the artwork, the exhibition, or the book. And then a student in Groningen has done it for the Wadden Sea as well, but it's a much bigger area, it's a much more challenging task. So there's sort of two blogs that sort of this all runs through. But the idea is really to show the depth of cultural richness and ecological richness, past and present, in these landscapes. And all this sort of stuff completely bypasses the people charged, the environmental managers really. They're sympathetic, they're interested in it, but when they start writing policy documents about how to look after these landscapes, all this amazing sort of cultural, emotional richness is completely lost to them, and they do these sort of surveys and things like that. And so we're doing this to say, look, these are really deep landscapes. Deep mapping is quite a thing that we sort of approve of, if you know what deep mapping is. And this is a way of deep mapping these things, because some of these artists have worked on these sites for years. They have incredible depth about the history, the ecology, or the sort of communities of these places. And if you start, so in a way these are like portals into the sort of cultural ecology and the ecology. And to go back to the three ecologies, this is articulated, and all this stuff, a lot of it is sort of, obviously has tidal elements, so that's what drove us to do it. So I'm writing a book about tides at the moment, or I'm meant to be anyway. So we've also done stuff on floods. There has been some terrible floods in 2007, well, all through the 2000s in the UK. And the Environment Agency say, look, we need to get communities to sort of understand their sort of water environments better. So we've done a lot of discussion about how memory might help people live with flooding. If you live on the River Severn, then it floods once every 50 years for certain. If you don't know that because nobody's told you, if your community can't remember, it's all, if the community starts remembering and even sort of thinking that flooding is part of its history, then your relationship with flooding is different. And the Environment Agency, the big agency charged with the resilience, they are sort of quite interested in all this sort of stuff, because you can't manage floods away to nothing, even if you build dikes, like the Dutch have done. But this is slightly different type of flooding anyway. But it's trying to change people's relationship with nature and water. And so on the Somerset Levels, which would have been on that previous map, if you look at the history of Somerset Levels, flooding was really part of people's sense of place. It was almost celebrated in culture. But that's when houses were different, communities were different, livelihoods were different. There's lots of oral history accounts of flooding where it wasn't seen as a problem. It was almost seen, like part of the seasonal excitement of living in this place. And if you can get people who see flooding like that as not as a problem of nature, which they're separated from, but part of where they live, part of their local ecology, then you have a totally different sort of prospect about how to manage floods and how to have a different type of resilience. So I'm going to talk about this project now, Towards Hydrocitizenship. So if this title is My Flesh Not Public, there was a conference in Westminster University last year called The Problem of the Public, saying, public is now such a challenged term due to the fragmentation of communities, the individualization of the self through various means, that the very notion of the public is politically and sort of theoretically questionable. But to me that is a denial of ecology. We are intrinsically public. Ecology is a public thing. You're interconnected with each other, with your environments. And obviously water is the most compelling part of that. So that thing says, how much water is in your teeth, which is a bit of a surprise. 10% of your teeth are water, if you believe it. I don't know. But so it's a pretty well-known fact that 60% of your body's water, maybe 70%. But I was thinking, how often does that cycle? And I try to sort of figure it out, and I don't know, but I guess maybe it has to cycle. So if you don't drink for 5 or 6 days, you'll die. So maybe it doesn't mean your body's completely empty of water. But I was trying to think how often all the molecules of water in your body are refreshed or changed. So it's obviously reasonably frequently. But if you think about where that water is coming from and coming through the taps, going through your body, going to the sewers, going into the rivers, the water in your body has been the sort of life space of aquatic creatures before, a few days before, and a few days afterwards will be again. And there's all this terrible stuff about the amount of medication that's being washed into the environments through human bodies, that it's really, there's terrible chemical pollution of the seas and the rivers through medication being washed through bodies and into the water, and then it attaches the plastic. We saw some talks in Stockholm at Environmental Humanities conference that were completely terrifying. The plastic, so the whole plastic in the sea thing is a really big issue, and it's not only these huge great piles of trash, but plastic breaks down into tiny microparticles. The chemicals really like sticking to plastic, or vice versa. So lots of these toxins and sort of medical chemicals in the water are sticking to the plastic, and the sea is sort of filling up with tiny anti-contraception pills. And there is a real question about more and more species just becoming sterile. And this is another way the world might end, or change very dramatically. All this stuff's going on, and we're completely unaware of it, because we're unaware. As a sort of individual body, you wash yourself, or you can excrete and flush it away, and then that's it. Your body's pure, and you have no sense of what's happening to the environment. But it's completely interconnected. So your ecological impact is profound. So in the UK, you get these hand cleaners that are full of micro granules of plastic, so when you rub it feels nice and abrasive. And I actually got a spoon of it and washed it all out, washed all the soap out in a coffee filter, and I ended up with 2 teaspoonfuls of microplastics. And I filmed all this, it's all on YouTube. And so people are cleansing themselves, and they're pushing that down the sink. That stuff is too fine. It won't be caught by the filters in the sewage systems. So all that stuff is going straight out into the environment. The whole thing is completely shocking. So there's lots of people, scientists at Southampton University, are hassling Unilever, who makes this soap powder, and they say we might, they are saying, right, we're beginning to see this as a problem now, so they might turn to using crushed up olive stones or something like that, which would be certainly much better. But at the moment, we're so unecological that we will put desperate pollutants into the stuff we clean our bodies with and just flush it down the toilet straight afterwards. So water is a really powerful example of ecological connection between humans and environment. So that's why we sort of focused on it. And so we want to talk about water in not just pollution, but in sort of water supply, water security, flood defence, and how we need to rethink our whole relationship with water. But also, can we work with people to be more to make them think they're more interconnected into the environment? So there's 8 universities involved in this. It's about £1.5 million, and there's a load of artists involved in it. We've got 4 case studies. We've got advisors from the sort of the government agencies. We've got local authority advisors on it, and there's a number of websites. But this is a community that one of the IRA's researchers has set up, and about 230 people around the world have joined it. Anybody can write on it, anybody can post on it. So we're trying to get it so we're not the only people authoring this. We've sort of given control away of this, and it's slightly scary if you're in charge of it. This is a very complicated website. There's masses of stuff on it. There's books, there's films, there's whole lists of things that are going on and stuff like that, not only in the UK but everywhere. So if people are interested in ecological citizenship, water, community, to have a look, and you have to sign up to sort of take part, but it's just literally putting an email address in, and then that's it. So ecological citizenship, RNS, deep ecology, that's where it comes from really, and there's a lot of amazing writers like in America, Lawrence Buell. They say unless you can reimagine, unless the modern human can reimagine what it is itself, unless you can rethink humans, unless humans can rethink themselves, you're really not going to address environmental issues in any meaningful way at all. You've got to go back to a more ecological basis of society, and obviously in a sort of different, not reflexive or unreflexive way. Some of the First Nation or Aboriginal senses of self were much more ecological. So ecological citizenship, it's not like saying we want to make people ecological citizens, because we're all really always ecological through what we eat, through what we breathe, through what we excrete and all the water stuff. We are ecological beings. Everything we do is ecological. Our body's got more non-human DNA in us than your own DNA. We're full of bacteria and other things that make us function. We are a biotic community as a self, but we've been taught to think we're a pure, separate, individual thing in our heads. So you can buy all this antibacterial stuff to purify your body, but it's actually killing your body, more or less. And so humans are ecological. So the trick is to begin to say, how can we begin to get people to really rethink that? But it's very difficult in modern society because the ecological footprint of a consuming human is massive and extremely complicated, extremely long and opaque, and also extremely unpleasant. So it's really difficult just to know what your ecological footprint is. But 2, if you start looking at it, it's going to be really, really upsetting. So to do this is quite challenging, and I do spend quite a lot of my time feeling quite upset and fed up, and my normal answer is going to drink lots of beer, actually, and I'm not joking either. So this slide says that really this is a challenge of and this is why I think conventional politics in the UK, we just had one of the most famous elections for 30 years. The environment was not really mentioned once in the whole thing. It is so beyond conventional politics. They don't even know what questions to ask, let alone what answers to provide. And because of the voting system in the UK, the Greens barely exist. But even I don't think in any modern society the environmental question is being addressed in a meaningful sense. The level of consumption that is embedded into modern life is really challenging. And then the inequalities and then the global aspects of it are really, really very, very bad scenarios. And so I think, but this is where we, as far as I'm concerned, this is where we're at, and we got to look at it. I'm going to hurry up a bit because it's getting a bit depressing. There is a funnier bit at the end, so I better get to that. So the projects are. The project aims to explore how ecological embeddedness, in the case of the
is the case in the context of local water resources, make visible our embeddedness in both historical, contemporary and future terms. So it's very much, this is an arts and humanities project, so history is telling the story of Bristol, the case study I'm involved in historical terms, how it's evolved around a river, how people have used the river, where Bristol gets its water from in the past, where it'll get its water from, can we get energy from the water in the future, from the tides, without destroying the tides. And another big thing is to say, look, a community is not just the people. A community is a larger assemblage, an actor network type theory of technologies, of infrastructure, but also of non-humans as well. The biodiversity in the water, maybe in the rivers or in the wetlands, is part of your community. So this goes back to the classic things like the land ethic that Leopold wrote in 1949, the first really important, one of the really first powerful ecological citizenship books was 1949, the Sand County Almanac. And then you had Rachel Carson, and then you had all the stuff. So environmental philosophy really kicked in after the Second World War, in this middle of the 20th century. It did get a certain point, but then it's hit up to the challenge of modern society, what it's like and how much it has to change. So Silent Spring, Rachel Carson, she said, guys, your agricultural system is just poisoning our landscape with DDT, which it was. And so, that was changed, but it was an extremely hard battle, but as just one component of what's going on. And so we're doing we're gathering lots of data about the water environment in cities. We're talking to communities, but we're talking about social issues as well as water issues. And then we're trying to generate win-win, small win-win situations where one example is there's a group that takes unemployed young people who have been in difficulty and stuff like that. They take them out on canal boats, and they say the being on a boat where it's really slow on a canal and it's very calming, they get them, it changes the whole dynamic, and they're trying to address environmental issues about water quality and the biodiversity in the canals, but at the same time they're trying to work with these people who, and with a therapeutic effect of between nature and culture. So, but that's because we're working with NGOs who know how to do that. That's in a way that we haven't got the skill to do that, but we've got partners who have. And so we're trying to encourage that, and we got the funding to give to them. So that's in our skill. Partly our skill was to get the money to give to them, and they can do it. So rethinking community. So I've talked about this a bit, but we're really keen to think of community in topographical terms, like a city or a parish or a village is a community of sorts, although obviously there's lots of questions about that. And that's topographical, lying around a community, but obviously communities are topological, they're connected through interests, through ecological connections, through trade connections. And then, so how do you merge that thinking together? How can you have a sense of community that is both topological and topographical? And water is really good at that, because water does work in catchments very literally and join people up. I haven't really mentioned this, but narrative is a big thing. So that's probably coming on to the end of this, as moving towards things like narrative. It's all very trendy at the moment. Some of the best geographers at the moment are saying, look, we've got to tell really good stories. It's not about being good theoreticians, in a way it's about being good storytellers. And they keep on saying the election, the Labour Party failed because they did not get their narrative right. They didn't get a clear narrative. They did not get it across. Humans are storytelling creatures. We make sense of ourselves as a story, as a narrative. We have a personal narrative of ourselves, of our history. We have a personal narrative about our community. So we live in an ecology of narrative. So how do you intervene in that? How do you seed new types of narratives into that? Historic, contemporary narratives. And so, finding other people's narratives by doing oral history in the city, co-creating narratives, and using film. So it's not just storytelling, but different forms of social media, multimedia, to get these new narratives into play. I'm not bothered with that, and I'm getting slightly, and that's, I've drone on about all that sort of stuff anyway. One of the things we've been told off a bit is that we mustn't assume that we're going to manage conflicts about water away, and that communities, in a way, you've always got to address the question of conflict if you're thinking about community. Conflict between interests, sometimes legitimate conflict, say between people who want to use a river for fishing and those who want to use it for canoeing. That's a real tension in the UK, but also conflict between nature conservation and flood defence. That's another real tension. And so we're thinking, well, what happens if you say, well, conflict is a connection that forms community? So community can be people who are in conflict. You look at a group or sets of people and non-humans. Conflict can create community, and is it useful, and does it help to think in those terms? That's sort of more experimental notion of this. And what would happen if you sort of somehow, if the Israeli-Palestine, which are obviously envisaged as two completely separate communities with a terrible otherness between them and conflict between them, if they could be reimagined as a community in themselves, then does that change the political dynamic of what is obviously the most terrible and difficult situation? So conflict, that's the sort of thing. But just to go back, and I get in sort of trouble over this a bit because I did go to art college, but I'm not really an artist, like a proper artist. I sort of dabble in it. But we're really trying to use arts-based methods. But the way to do that really is not us to dabble in it. But so we're employing freelance artists who are very skilled at working with communities, but are also very skilled artists, either in filmmaking or installation making, or sort of hybrid nature society stuff. And this is the whole thing. This is not research. This is not representational research, looking at the world and reporting back on it. This is going out with these communities with artists to try and make a new thing, which might be just a change in the narrative about how people see themselves and see their city and see their water and their sort of and the biology in their city. So there's lots of different people with different skills. Ecocultural mapping, which could be even GIS based, but sort of soft GIS, and deep mapping. If you Google that, you'll find out what it is. There's some famous books about it. It's storying, site-specific intervention. Walking is a very intuitive. It's no good trying to reinvent the wheel. Walking is a really powerful art practice. Walking is super trendy in the UK at the moment in terms of research and art and writing. So, if it works, let's use it. But film is really important. So there's a film coming up in a minute. I'm trying to hurry up a bit. So one of our partners, so we were talking about this in a really nice community centre in quite a deprived part of Bradford, really poor neighbourhood. And so this community partner, we're all here waffling on all this environmental philosophy stuff, and he's there with people, with really difficult social issues. And we were saying, look, we want to change people's narratives. Excuse me, I'll just get some water. And he said, it's cutting through the noise. People are living so much noise, consumption noise. I love football. I play football. I really love watching football on TV, and I know the big matches on tonight and stuff. But in the UK, people are obsessed by football, and people pour enormous emotional and sort of people build identities through being attached to, these big football teams. They're desperate to find a narrative to build a sort of a life around. I see it as a form of sort of neo-dwelling. People want to belong to something. But football is an incredibly compelling narrative. The leagues, who's winning, who's losing, who's buying what player, which manager's having a hard time. So it's an incredibly powerful and vivid narrative that can completely get hold of people, and people can live inside and almost build their lives around. So how can you cut through all that noise and talk about plastic being flushed down the loo and stuff like that? There's a really good book out in 2008 called "Telling Stories to Change the World." It's by, the names are up there. And what these guys have done, they've gone around the world, particularly sort of in the developing world, and looked at case studies where activists and artists, not only activists and artists, but a lot of it was, are working with communities to really change what's going on the ground. And so it's got about 20 or 30 case studies in it. And one of them is actually a really moving and upsetting thing about the rivers in sort of like New Mexico, and how traditional cultures really built their lives around these rivers. These rivers are being commodified, dammed, destroyed basically, and it's a lament for the loss of this landscape. Really, really powerful thing. But it says, social justice activists, artists and project leaders all over the world are insisting on the power that stories have to change the world, and stories to generate hope and engagement, personal dignity and active citizenship, the pride of identity and the humility of human connectedness. So we're really trying to, so our project is still quite early days, but we're really going to try and push this whole, like, we're generating stories of different types. So rather than talk anymore, because I'm getting fed up with listening to it myself, I'm just going to show you a film. It's only about 5 minutes long, but I just sort of, I thought, so there's a guy, so we're really, humour crops us, you know, as you can tell, I'm seriously not funny. But I'm quite intrigued to this because our project partners have used humour in, well, I hope you'll think it's funny, all bits of it. And I think that might be a really important part of the narrative. And the emotional turn has been really important in what we're doing. You know, like, humans are emotional before they're rational, before they're anything else. If you don't, if your narratives don't engage with that, if your politics and your culture don't understand that, you're in deep trouble. Affect, the whole idea that most of what we do is pre-consciousness. Most of what we do is about the body being in automated mode and stuff like that. There's a guy at Free University of Munich, Free University called Berlin, who does all this stuff about critical neuroscience and extended emotion theory. It's about how human, you know, how what we think is a human is completely off the wall, you know, and neuroscience is really beginning to show this. All this stuff, most of this stuff's online as PDFs, so I recommend looking at that. So I hope this is going to work if I click on this link. And this is just an example of so in Bristol, by chance, there's been the highest tides in Bristol for 20 years. Well, everywhere, in fact, because the moon has got a funny orbit. It's not completely constant. Once every 20 years, the moon gets a bit closer to the Earth, so you get really big tides. And, you know, we're saying tides are a really big part of Bristol's history. Bristol is only where it is because the tide allowed ships to go up and down the river and stuff like that. And Bristol docks and what was carried in, all the trade and stuff like that. And the whole city had to be sort of shaped around the tides to a certain extent, although the docks have been moved downstream. So we've invented, well, we've been working with a charity and a theatre company, and really they went off and did it on their own, which is quite nice, really. So I'm not even sure if this is part of my project or not, but I think it probably is. But we sort of had these sort of workshops with them, and the two theatre guys came up with these two characters called Proxy and Perry, which are two tidal terms. And then we're having a whole load of events, and we're telling a story of Bristol's water through these two characters, and it's all being filmed properly. But I just filmed this on my I filmed this on my, I don't know how to also do. I filmed this on a camera I had.
Good people of Bristol and the Green Scrapitol, gathered here today at the Grand Syzygy, and you're here in this unique concatenation of the waters, and amongst these lovely people to take an oath in sight of the assembled crowd, and to swear your allegiance to the tides and all that sail upon them. Hold up your right hand. Say aye. Aye. Say aye aye. Aye. Say aye aye, Captain. Aye. Say aye 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 aye, like you very much. Don't be stupid. You started it. Aye. Aye. Hereby. Do solemnly swear. Do solemnly swear. Upon the tidal reaches of the Avon. Upon the tidal reaches of the Avon. And the Bristol Channel. And the Bristol Channel. Upon the Bay of Fundy. Upon the Bay of Fundy. Where's that? What's the other? In the name of the sun and the moon. In the name of the sun and the moon. Upon the eels, the salmon and the lamprey. Upon the eels, the salmon and the lamprey. Upon the cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh. Upon the cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh. In sight of the reeds of the red shank. In sight of the reeds of the red shank. Upon the oyster of the world. Upon the oyster of the world. To hereby. To hereby. Ever to. Ever to. Always. Always. In eternity. In eternity. In constancy. In constancy. Forever. Forever. Till the tides do us part. Till the tides do us part. To. Visit the river. Visit the river. Witness the boar. Witness the boar. Paddle in the seas. Search in the tidal pools. Drink from the springs. To take to the pill at the Shire Hampton. To gorge upon the suspension of particulates. To love the Avon and all her tributaries. To never frown upon the froom. To take the new cut seriously. And wait a minute, I've messed up my pages.
Wait a minute, I've messed up my pages. Don't have to repeat that.
To reimagine the nature of citizenship. And community from ecological perspectives. That's a direct quote. To recognise the flow of water through everything. To embrace the fluidity of all things. Wait till I finish. Don't repeat everything I say. To embrace the fluidity of all things. To love my loo. Not just mine, yours as well. With only the 3 P's. Paper, pee and poo. And furthermore, to never, ever to, again, drink water. From a plastic bottle.
It's from a tap! I just filled it up!
To be green! With envy! Whenever I see someone on a bicycle. To understand marine energy and ecology! To lock into my heritage and my future! To embrace hydropoetics! Art and music! Till the day I die! Not long now. To love the water cycle! And the bicycle! To champion biodiversity! And be part of Water City! Nearly finished. To be a hydro-citizen for the 21st century! And to learn to love my ties! Amen! Mermen! Barmen! So help me squid! Thank you very much.
So they'd got mud out the river, so everybody did mud paintings. That's why everybody had mud on their hands. And the people in white tops, there's a load of young people being trained as journalists.
If an amendment passes today in North Carolina, it could deal a huge blow to the national fight for marriage equality. North Carolina is the only state in the South.
So there's a series of films and events with those two characters, and it's all half happened, not quite by accident, but there's some much more. There's some professional film people there seeing film, and the film that they've made is pretty amazing. They're using these drones. It's just a complete aside really. So they're using these little drones to film them from the air, and it just looks like a huge, great Hollywood blockbuster. The whole thing's so they're coming up the river on a boat. So we're going to try and develop it as a narrative of using those characters to talk about various water issues in Bristol, and they go into schools and they're going to events and stuff like that, and it's all part of Bristol Green Capital because it's Bristol. Why Bristol is Green Capital of Europe, I've got no idea. But anyway, it's such a terrible city for traffic and pollution and stuff. But anyway, so that's just an example of stuff that's coming out of that project, which is really using film, theatre, street theatre,
sometimes in a quite clunky way but just try and, break up people's imaginations. And so there was the public invited to that. It was freezing cold when we did it, but the turnout wasn't too bad. We did give them free food to try and get them there. But that business of how to cut through the noise and get new narratives into people's heads is something we're all struggling on with. But I think I'll stop at that point.